I signed the supply logs knowing the numbers were clean, even as the waste bins filled. My orders were clear, and my superiors wanted routine, not questions. I watched prisoners study what we discarded and understood what the system was telling them. I adjusted nothing that could be named and carried the weight of what could not be undone. In the summer of 1943, the United States War Department faced the practical task of housing and managing a rapidly growing number of Axis prisoners of war. Following the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942 and the subsequent Tunisian campaign in early 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured and transported across the Atlantic. By mid-1943, the first large contingents of German prisoners were arriving at ports on the eastern seaboard of the United States. From there, they were dispersed by rail to newly constructed or rapidly expanded prisoner of war camps across the country. One such camp was Camp Swift, located near Bastrop, Texas. Originally built as a U.S. Army training facility, Camp Swift was converted in early 1943 to accommodate German prisoners captured in North Africa. The site was chosen for its rail access, distance from the coast, and the availability of land suitable for fencing, barracks, and support facilities. Similar camps were established in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and other interior states, reflecting the War Department's preference for placing prisoners far from strategic industrial centers and ports. The German prisoners arriving at Camp Swift in the late summer of 1943 were primarily members of the Afrika Korps and supporting units. Many had endured long periods of combat in the desert, followed by weeks in temporary holding areas in North Africa. Food shortages, limited medical care, and constant movement had shaped their expectations. Their understanding of American conditions came mostly from propaganda, rumor, and fragmentary intelligence. Few had any direct experience of the United States. Daily operations at Camp Swift were overseen by a rotating staff of U.S. Army officers, enlisted guards, medical personnel, and civilian employees. Among them was Harold W. Peterson, a logistics and supply officer assigned to the camp's Quartermaster section. Peterson was a reservist in his early 30s, with pre-war experience in commercial warehousing. His role at Camp Swift was not combat-related. Instead, he was responsible for overseeing the receipt, storage, and distribution of food, clothing, and basic supplies for both American personnel and the prisoner population. Peterson's workday followed a predictable routine. Each morning began with inventory reports from the camp warehouses, followed by coordination with regional supply depots. Food deliveries arrived by rail several times a week, supplemented by local contracts for produce, dairy, and meat. The Quartermaster section prepared menus in accordance with War Department regulations and the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required that prisoners of war be fed rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those issued to the detaining power's own troops. By the standards of the U.S. Army in 1943, these rations were substantial. American soldiers were allocated a caloric intake designed to support physically demanding training and labor, often exceeding 3,500 calories per day. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, sugar, and dairy products were standard components. Frozen desserts, including ice cream, were increasingly common in stateside camps due to improvements in refrigeration and the expansion of the American dairy industry during the war. The presence of ice cream in Army rations was not accidental. By the early 1940s, ice cream had become a symbol of American industrial capacity and civilian morale. Military planners viewed it as a low-cost way to boost troop satisfaction, especially in training environments. Portable refrigeration units and insulated containers allowed ice cream to be produced centrally and shipped to bases across the country. In Texas, where dairy operations were well established, ice cream was readily available. At Camp Swift, ice cream was served several times a week to American personnel, often as part of the evening meal. In warmer months, it was sometimes provided daily. The practice was considered routine and unremarkable by the camp's American staff. For Peterson, it was simply another line item in the supply ledger, tracked alongside meat rations and flour shipments. The German prisoners observed these routines from a distance. Their daily lives were structured around roll calls, work details, meals, and periods of rest. Most were housed in wooden barracks enclosed by barbed wire fencing, with guard towers positioned at regular intervals. Work assignments included maintenance, kitchen assistance, and agricultural labor on nearby farms under supervised conditions. Meals for the prisoners were prepared in separate kitchens, but followed the same basic ration scale as those for American troops. Bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee substitutes were issued regularly. However, certain items, including ice cream, were not typically served to prisoners, not because of deliberate deprivation, but due to practical considerations. Frozen foods required additional handling, and regulations did not mandate their inclusion in prisoner meals. Despite this, the proximity of American mess halls meant that prisoners could see and sometimes smell foods unfamiliar to them. On warm evenings, German work details returning from assignments would pass near the American dining facilities. It was during these moments that the contrast became visible. Peterson first became aware of the prisoners' reaction through informal reports from kitchen staff. Enlisted cooks mentioned that German prisoners assigned to mess hall cleanup duties appeared unusually attentive to leftover food. They lingered near disposal areas and asked questions, in limited English or through interpreters, about items being thrown away. Ice cream containers, emptied after service, attracted particular interest. At first, these observations did not seem significant. The Quartermaster section was accustomed to managing waste, and leftovers were expected byproducts of large-scale food service. Regulations required that excess food be disposed of in controlled ways to prevent spoilage and pest problems. Ice cream, once melted, could not be reused. As weeks passed, however, Peterson noted a pattern. Reports from multiple staff members described prisoners watching American soldiers eat ice cream with visible curiosity. Some prisoners reportedly asked whether the ice cream was reserved for special occasions or officers. When told it was a regular item, they expressed disbelief. Peterson arranged for an interpreter to speak informally with several prisoners during a routine inspection of the kitchens. The conversation was not recorded verbatim, but Peterson later summarized it in a memorandum to his superior. The prisoners explained that during the later stages of the North African campaign, German rations had been severely reduced. Dairy products were virtually non-existent, sugar was scarce, frozen foods were unknown in field conditions. More striking to Peterson was the prisoners' reaction to waste. American soldiers often discarded partially eaten servings of ice cream if they melted, or if the soldier did not want dessert that day. To the prisoners, this behavior was difficult to reconcile with their recent experiences of scarcity. One prisoner reportedly remarked that such food would have been shared among several men in his former unit. Peterson did not interpret these reactions as hostility or propaganda influence. Instead, he saw them as an indication of a broader gap in material expectations. The prisoners were not complaining about their own rations, which met international standards. Rather, they were reacting to the scale and apparent casualness of American abundance. From an operational standpoint, this posed a subtle problem. The War Department emphasized that prisoners should be treated humanely, but not indulged in ways that could undermine discipline or provoke resentment among American troops. At the same time, visible disparities risked affecting prisoner morale in unpredictable ways. Excessive admiration could lead to unrealistic expectations, while perceived waste might foster quiet resentment or confusion. Peterson raised the issue during a routine staff meeting in early September 1943. He did not frame it as a crisis, but as an observation worth noting. The camp commander acknowledged the report and instructed staff to continue following established regulations. No immediate changes were ordered. As summer gave way to autumn, the situation remained unresolved. Ice cream continued to be served regularly to American personnel. German prisoners continued to observe and quietly comment among themselves. The camp functioned smoothly, with no incidents or formal complaints. Yet for Peterson, the contrast between abundance and recent deprivation remained a persistent, if understated, feature of daily operations.
By the end of September 1943, it was clear that what seemed routine to American staff represented something fundamentally unfamiliar to the prisoners. The issue was not one of supply shortages or violations of policy, but of perception. The significance of that perception had not yet been fully considered.
By October 1943, the population of German prisoners at Camp Swift had stabilized at several thousand men. Similar numbers were held at nearby satellite camps across central Texas. The administrative rhythm of the camp became more regular as construction finished and procedures were standardized. Guard rotations, work details, and supply deliveries followed predictable schedules. From the standpoint of the War Department, the system was functioning as intended. The observations raised by Captain Peterson did not immediately lead to policy changes, but they did not disappear. Reports from other camps in the region began to reflect similar patterns. At Camp Hearn and Camp Hood, quartermaster officers noted that German prisoners paid close attention to American mess operations. In after-action summaries and routine correspondence, officers described prisoner reactions not as disciplinary problems, but as persistent points of curiosity. The issue grew more noticeable as work details expanded. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned non-military labor, and by late 1943, German POWs in Texas were increasingly used for agricultural work. Local farmers, facing labor shortages due to the draft, contracted with the Army to employ prisoners under guard. These work details brought prisoners into closer contact with American civilians and soldiers, exposing them to civilian diets and consumer goods. Prisoners returning from farm labor occasionally mentioned seeing ice cream sold at roadside stands or in town stores. These accounts circulated within the camp. For men who had not seen such items during years of war and rationing, the contrast reinforced earlier impressions formed inside the wire. The abundance was no longer confined to the camp environment. It appeared to be a feature of American society as a whole. Peterson's responsibilities placed him at the intersection of supply efficiency and regulation. The War Department issued frequent circulars emphasizing cost control and waste reduction, particularly as the war expanded and overseas demands increased. While the United States possessed significant industrial capacity, it was not immune to logistical strain. Shipping priorities favored combat theaters, and stateside installations were expected to manage resources responsibly. Ice cream, despite its morale value, was not considered essential. In late October, Peterson received guidance reminding quartermasters to minimize spoilage and unnecessary disposal of perishable goods. The guidance did not single out ice cream, but it underscored the importance of avoiding visible waste, especially in environments where prisoners or civilian workers were present. Peterson attempted modest adjustments within his authority. He instructed mess sergeants to better estimate portion sizes and to reduce overproduction during evening meals. These measures had limited effect. Ice cream was issued in standardized containers, and individual preferences varied. Some soldiers declined dessert altogether, while others consumed only part of their serving. Melted ice cream remained a disposal issue, particularly during warmer days that persisted into October. Meanwhile, the prisoners' reactions became more structured. Interpreters reported that discussions among the prisoners increasingly linked American food practices to broader conclusions about the war. While overt political statements were rare, there were indications that some prisoners were reassessing earlier assumptions. American propaganda films shown in the camp emphasized industrial output and agricultural productivity, but these films were often dismissed as exaggerations. The daily observation of abundant food, however, was more difficult to dismiss. Camp intelligence officers monitored prisoner morale as part of routine security assessments. They noted no signs of unrest or organized resistance. Instead, reports described a subdued acceptance combined with quiet astonishment. Some prisoners expressed admiration for American logistics. Others expressed confusion about how such abundance could coexist with global war. The War Department's official doctrine towards prisoners emphasized neutrality. Guards were instructed to avoid political discussions and to maintain professional distance.
There was concern that excessive fraternization or visible indulgence could undermine authority. At the same time, mistreatment or unnecessary austerity was prohibited. This balance left little room for addressing perceptions that arose indirectly from everyday operations. Peterson raised the issue again in a written report forwarded through the camp commander to the 8th Service Command headquarters in Dallas. The report outlined observed prisoner reactions to American food waste, specifically frozen desserts, and suggested that clearer guidance might be useful. He did not propose serving ice cream to prisoners, nor did he suggest restricting it for American troops. His concern was that unmanaged perceptions could have unintended effects on discipline and morale. The response from headquarters was non-committal. The matter was acknowledged, but no directive followed. The prevailing view was that as long as regulations were followed and prisoners were adequately fed, additional considerations were unnecessary. The Geneva Convention did not address comparative visibility of food consumption, and existing policy was deemed sufficient. As autumn progressed, operational pressures increased. More prisoners arrived from Italy following the Allied invasion of Sicily and the Italian mainland. Although Italian prisoners were held separately, their arrival strained camp resources and staff attention. Quartermaster sections were tasked with integrating new supply demands while maintaining standards for existing populations. In this environment, small inefficiencies became harder to address. Ice cream deliveries continued as scheduled, tied to broader contracts serving multiple installations. Adjusting these contracts would have required higher-level approval, which was unlikely to be granted for a non-essential item. Waste reduction efforts remained localized and limited. The prisoners' exposure to American abundance expanded further during the holiday season. Thanksgiving in November brought larger meals for American personnel, including additional desserts. Although prisoners received improved rations in line with regulations, the disparity in variety was noticeable. Guards reported that prisoners assigned to kitchen work showed heightened interest during these periods, carefully observing preparation and disposal practices. Peterson noted that the issue was no longer confined to individual curiosity. It had become part of the camp's informal knowledge environment. New prisoners quickly learned that American soldiers ate ice cream regularly, even in winter. The information circulated alongside other observations about clothing quality, medical supplies, and recreational facilities. From a doctrinal perspective, this posed a challenge. The War Department relied on clear, codified rules to manage large systems. Perceptions, however, were not easily regulated. The contrast between doctrine, which focused on equivalence of rations, and reality, which included visible abundance and waste, created a gap that policy did not address. Repeated attempts to manage the issue through minor adjustments failed to produce meaningful change. Waste continued at manageable but visible levels. Prisoner reactions continued, quiet but persistent. There were no incidents that justified escalation, yet the underlying tension remained. By December 1943, Peterson concluded that the matter would not resolve itself through routine administration. It was not a crisis, but it was no longer incidental. The operational system was functioning, but an unacknowledged discrepancy between policy and perception had emerged. How that discrepancy would be addressed, or whether it would be addressed at all, remained
In early
uncertain.
January 1944, Camp Swift entered its second winter as a prisoner of war installation. Although Central Texas winters were mild compared to northern states, colder temperatures reduced some of the logistical challenges associated with perishable food. Ice cream continued to be delivered and served, though less frequently than during summer months. Refrigeration units operated more efficiently, and spoilage decreased slightly. The fundamental pattern, however, remained unchanged. Captain Peterson's perspective shifted as the camp's population diversified. Prisoners captured in Italy and later in southern France arrived with different experiences than those from North Africa. Many had endured extended shortages during the later stages of the war. Their reactions to American food practices were often more pronounced. Intelligence summaries noted that these prisoners were quicker to draw conclusions about the material balance between the Axis and the Allies. Peterson observed that the conversations he overheard through interpreters or second-hand reports were no longer limited to curiosity. Prisoners increasingly discussed American production capacity in concrete terms. Ice cream became a recurring reference point, not because of its nutritional value, but because it represented discretionary consumption. The fact that American soldiers could eat such items regularly, even while fighting a global war, challenged assumptions the prisoners had absorbed from German propaganda. The War Department's prisoner handling doctrine did not anticipate this kind of indirect influence. Propaganda efforts aimed at prisoners were tightly controlled. Official films, pamphlets, and lectures were vetted to avoid political messaging that could violate neutrality. Yet the daily environment of the camp itself conveyed information without intention or oversight. Peterson recognized that this environment was shaping prisoner perceptions more effectively than any formal program. The realization did not lead him toward overt action, but it did prompt a reevaluation of his role. As a quartermaster officer, his responsibilities were defined narrowly. He was not tasked with psychological operations or intelligence work. Nonetheless, his decisions influenced what prisoners saw and inferred. The turning point came through a routine inspection rather than a dramatic event. During a scheduled review of waste disposal practices in mid-January 1944, Peterson accompanied a sanitation officer to observe trash handling near the American mess halls. Several German prisoners were assigned to supervised cleanup duties nearby. As ice cream containers were discarded, one prisoner asked through an interpreter whether the ice cream was spoiled. When told that it was simply leftover, the prisoner responded that in his former unit, melted ice cream would have been eaten with a spoon. The remark was not confrontational, it was delivered matter-of-factly. For Peterson, it crystallized a pattern he had been observing for months. The issue was no longer about waste management, it was about the silent transmission of information through routine practice. Peterson documented the exchange in his daily log. Later that week, he reviewed prior correspondence and reports from other camps. Similar observations appeared elsewhere, though often buried in routine language. No single report was decisive, but collectively they suggested a systemic phenomenon. At this point, Peterson made an unofficial adjustment within the limits of his authority. He did not alter ration scales or violate regulations. Instead, he coordinated with mess sergeants to implement a practice of redistributing unopened ice cream portions to later meals when feasible, rather than discarding them immediately. Melted portions were still disposed of, but the volume of visible waste was reduced. This change required additional coordination and was not mandated by policy. It relied on cooperation from enlisted staff, some of whom viewed it as unnecessary. Peterson framed the change in terms of efficiency and cost control, aligning it with existing directives. He did not reference prisoner perceptions in official instructions. The effects were incremental. Prisoners assigned to cleanup details noticed that fewer containers were discarded. Ice cream did not disappear from American meals, but its disposal became less conspicuous. The change did not eliminate the contrast, but it moderated one of its most visible aspects. Peterson also adjusted his own interactions. During inspections, he avoided dismissive explanations and instead provided straightforward answers when prisoners asked about food practices. He did not offer commentary on American abundance, but he did not deny what was plainly visible. This approach adhered to neutrality while acknowledging reality. The risk associated with these adjustments was limited but real. Any deviation from established routines could be questioned by superiors. Peterson ensured that all changes were documented as efficiency measures. He did not seek formal approval, calculating that the adjustments fell within his discretionary authority as a quartermaster officer. Intelligence officers at the camp continued to monitor prisoner morale. In reports from late January and February 1944, there were subtle shifts in tone. Prisoners were described as more resigned than astonished. Discussions of American food practices continued, but they were less animated. Ice cream remained a reference point, but it was now mentioned alongside other observations about housing quality and medical care. The broader operational context also evolved.
As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, resources were increasingly directed overseas. Stateside installations were instructed to streamline operations where possible. Peterson's adjustments aligned with this emphasis, further insulating them from scrutiny. By March 1944, the issue had become part of the background of camp life rather than a focal point. The unofficial changes did not resolve the underlying disparity, but they demonstrated that routine practices could influence perception in measurable ways. Peterson did not consider his actions exceptional. They were small, administrative decisions made within an existing system. Yet they marked a shift from passive observation to conscious adjustment. The implications of that shift, both for prisoner perception and for institutional norms, had not yet fully emerged.
By the spring of 1944, Camp Swift operated within a more tightly regulated administrative environment than it had the previous year. The War Department, anticipating the opening of a major front in Western Europe, issued a series of directives emphasizing uniformity across stateside installations. Efficiency, predictability, and strict adherence to established procedures were prioritized. Any deviation from standard practice, however minor, was increasingly subject to review. Captain Peterson's adjustments to food handling practices remained in place, but they did not go unnoticed. During a routine inspection in April, an officer from the 8th Service Command's Quartermaster Division reviewed Camp Swift's supply logs and waste reports. The data showed a modest reduction in discarded frozen desserts compared to previous months. While the figures were not alarming, they differed from averages recorded at similar installations. The inspecting officer requested clarification. Peterson explained the reduction in terms of improved portion control and redistribution of unopened items. He cited War Department guidance on waste reduction and cost efficiency. The explanation was accurate and supported by documentation. Nevertheless, the inspector noted the change and included it in his report. Shortly afterward, Peterson was asked to provide a written statement detailing the rationale for the adjustments. The request did not imply misconduct, but it signaled heightened scrutiny. In his response, Peterson avoided any mention of prisoner perceptions. He framed the changes solely as logistical improvements consistent with broader efficiency goals. At the same time, camp intelligence officers reported a shift in prisoner discussions. While the earlier astonishment at American food abundance had diminished, it had not disappeared. Instead, it had been integrated into a broader assessment of American capacity. Prisoners spoke less about individual items and more about systems, transport, refrigeration, and agricultural output. Ice cream, once a focal point, became an example rather than the subject. This evolution raised concerns among some officers responsible for camp security. Although there was no evidence of unrest, there was awareness that prisoners were drawing conclusions beyond what official doctrine addressed. The War Department's position remained that such conclusions were unavoidable and not inherently problematic, provided discipline was maintained. In May 1944, a memorandum circulated within the Service Command, reiterating the importance of consistent treatment of prisoners across camps. The document cautioned against unauthorized modifications to established practices, even when well-intentioned. It did not reference Camp Swift directly, but its timing was notable. The camp commander discussed the memorandum with senior staff, including Peterson. During the meeting, the commander emphasized compliance and warned against initiatives that could be misinterpreted as favoritism or experimentation. Peterson acknowledged the guidance and agreed to ensure that all practices aligned clearly with regulations. Following the meeting, Peterson reviewed his procedures. He concluded that while his adjustments were defensible, they occupied an ambiguous space. To avoid further scrutiny, he scaled back some measures, returning certain aspects of food handling to standard practice. Redistribution of unopened ice cream continued when convenient, but the emphasis on reducing visible disposal was less explicit. The effect was gradual. Prisoners again observed discarded containers, though not at previous levels. The camp returned to a more typical operational profile, consistent with other installations in the region.
From an administrative standpoint, the issue appeared resolved. Yet the underlying tension between policy and perception remained. The War Department could regulate rations and procedures, but it could not fully control what prisoners inferred from daily life. The visible contrast between American abundance and European scarcity continued to shape prisoner understanding, regardless of minor adjustments. As preparations for the Normandy invasion intensified, attention shifted away from stateside prisoner management. Camp Swift's role became routine and peripheral to the main effort. Peterson returned his focus to meeting supply quotas and preparing for potential redeployments of personnel. By early June 1944, the camp functioned smoothly under established norms. The earlier concerns had not escalated into conflict or formal policy change. They had, however, revealed the limits of doctrine when confronted with everyday realities. The question of how much unintended influence routine practices exerted on prisoners was left largely unexamined at the institutional level. For Peterson, the experience underscored that even minor administrative decisions could carry implications beyond their immediate purpose. Those implications, however, would remain largely unrecorded as the war moved into its decisive phase.
By the late summer of 1944, the operational importance of prisoner of war camps inside the United States had receded further into the administrative background of the war. Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June, and by August they were advancing across France. The focus of military planning and public attention shifted decisively overseas. Stateside installations like Camp Swift continued their work, but largely outside the spotlight. The German prisoners at Camp Swift followed developments through permitted channels. Official news summaries, carefully filtered, were posted in common areas. Guards occasionally answered factual questions, but avoided speculation. As the front moved closer to Germany's borders, the prisoners' earlier astonishment at American abundance took on a different character. It was no longer simply a matter of disbelief. It became part of a broader reassessment of their situation. Ice cream remained present in American mess halls, though less frequently as rationing priorities adjusted and personnel turnover increased. For the prisoners, it no longer carried the same immediacy it once had. It had become familiar, even if still striking. The daily routines of captivity, work details, roll calls, correspondence, now dominated attention. Captain Peterson's role evolved as well. In September 1944, he received notice that he would be transferred to another stateside assignment. His replacement would inherit a camp that operated fully within standard procedures, without any special measures or unresolved issues flagged in its records. Peterson prepared transition documents that focused strictly on supply metrics and compliance. Her earlier observations about perception and contrast did not appear in these summaries. From an institutional perspective, the matter left little trace. War Department evaluations of POW camp operations emphasized compliance with international law, cost efficiency, and security. Camp Swift consistently met these criteria. No incidents related to food distribution or prisoner morale were recorded that required higher-level intervention. Yet the experience had a lasting effect on individual understanding. Interviews conducted after the war with former German prisoners frequently mentioned food as a point of reference when describing captivity in the United States. Ice cream appeared in several accounts, not as a grievance or indulgence, but as a symbol. For men who had lived under rationing and collapse, its routine presence conveyed information more effectively than official statements ever could. These accounts, collected years later by historians and oral history projects, reveal a consistent theme. Prisoners did not interpret American food practices as mockery or deliberate display. They interpreted them as evidence of a system operating on a different scale. The waste, they observed, was not seen as cruelty, but as a byproduct of abundance that was difficult to comprehend. From the American side, the issue rarely surfaced in retrospective analyses. Quartermaster reports and camp records treated food distribution as a technical matter. Ice cream was listed alongside other commodities, without commentary. The assumption that such items were normal aspects of life went largely unexamined.
This asymmetry of perception highlights a broader reality of the war. Power was not communicated only through weapons or strategy, but through everyday logistics. Refrigeration, transport, and agricultural surplus shaped impressions in ways that doctrine did not fully account for. For prisoners removed from the battlefield, these impressions accumulated quietly. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, preparations began for repatriation. German prisoners were gradually returned to Europe over the following months. Many left the United States with mixed memories, strict discipline combined with material adequacy, confinement paired with exposure to unfamiliar prosperity. Food remained one of the most frequently cited elements of that experience. Camp Swift was decommissioned as a POW facility in 1946. Its records were archived, its barracks dismantled or repurposed. Captain Peterson returned to civilian life, his wartime service recorded in standard terms. There is no evidence that he reflected publicly on the significance of his observations. Like many administrative officers, his contributions were absorbed into the larger machinery of war. The episode of German prisoners watching American soldiers eat ice cream did not alter policy, redirect strategy, or produce official lessons. It did not need to. Its significance lies in what it reveals about how wars are understood by those caught within them. The most powerful messages are not always delivered intentionally. Sometimes they appear in routine acts, repeated daily, unnoticed by those performing them. In the controlled environment of a prisoner of war camp, where information was regulated and behavior prescribed, abundance itself became a form of communication. It required no explanation. It was visible, tangible, and persistent. For the prisoners, it challenged assumptions formed under years of deprivation. For the captors, it remained ordinary. When historians examine the experience of Axis prisoners in the United States, they often focus on legal compliance and security. The quieter dimension, the unintended influence of daily life, receives less attention. Yet it is in these details that a fuller understanding emerges. The story of German prisoners encountering ice cream in American camps is not a tale of spectacle or humiliation. It is a record of contrast. It illustrates how material conditions, shaped by industrial capacity and logistics, conveyed realities that ideology could not fully obscure. It also demonstrates the limits of control within large systems. Regulations could dictate rations, but not meaning. In the end, the prisoners returned home with memories shaped as much by what they saw as by what they were told. Among those memories, the image of American soldiers eating ice cream, casually, routinely, remained fixed, not because it was extraordinary to Americans, but because it was not.